They weren't born with rifles in their hands or fire in their eyes, no, that came later. Before the world called them rebels, they were sons of the soil. Farmers. Laborers. Mothers' boys. Men of the hoe and hearth. They named themselves the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, a title carved from pain and purpose. But the British, they called them Mau Mau, a name that hissed off colonial tongues like a curse in the wind. No one truly knows where that name came from, maybe an insult, maybe just fear wearing a mask. But let's not get it twisted, these weren't just angry men with sharp blades. They were mostly Kikuyu, joined by brave souls from the Embu and Meru, bound not by tribe but by a shared hunger for justice. Their enemy wasn't just the man in the khaki hat, it was history itself. They fought not for blood, but for land. Land that had been stolen, fenced off, renamed and reaped by foreign hands. Land that whispered their ancestors' names beneath its roots. What stirred in them wasn't madness, it was memory. Of fields once walked barefoot. Of streams once sung into. Of forests now forbidden. And when memory becomes weaponized, when a people decide that silence is betrayal, what rises isn't a rebellion, it's a reckoning. It didn't start with bullets. It started with borders. Invisible lines carved deep into the soil, where once open fields ran free under the Kikuyu sun. By the 1930s, the heart of Kenya, the White Highlands, had turned ghostly for its native keepers. Millions of acres gone, snatched by settlers who sowed someone else's land. While the Kikuyu were packed like cattle into tight reserves, overcrowded, overworked, overlooked. Imagine being told your grandfather's farm is now off limits. Imagine being fenced out of your own childhood. And then came the war, the big one. World War II took many young Kikuyu men far from home, fighting under a foreign flag, chasing Hitler's shadows across deserts and seas. They returned with boots dusted in victory and medals that glinted like promises. But what waited for them? Not land. Not honor. Just locked doors, empty hands, and whispered lies. No land. No jobs. No thank you. The seeds of rebellion were planted not just in the soil, but in the soul. They watered them with silence and waited. Waited as hope dried up, as voices were ignored. Until that silence thickened. Coiled tight. Then snapped. This wasn't just protest. It was a long-held scream finally breaking free. Before the rifles spoke. Before the machetes gleamed under moonlight. There were meetings held in hushed corners. Ink on paper, not blood on leaves. The Kenya African Study Union, later called KAU, stepped forward first, dressed in suits and patience. They knocked on doors, wrote petitions, spoke in halls where power never truly listened. They tried the way of reason. Words over weapons, diplomacy over fire. But reform, promised in whispers, always arrived too late, or not at all. And so, in the quiet spaces where disappointment curdled into resolve, a different kind of rhythm began to pulse. One that didn't beg. One that didn't wait. By 1952, frustration had grown legs and vanished into the forests. There, among the shadows of the trees, men took oaths, not lightly, not blindly. Sworn to secrecy. Sworn to sacrifice. Oaths that tied the tongue, gripped the heart, and promised blood if betrayed. What was once a call for reform was now a whisper of resistance. Cells formed like a heartbeat, scattered but synced. Hidden in the Aberdare Range and the belly of Mount Kenya. No more petitions. No more pleas. Just silence, strategy, and sharpening steel. Not every leader carries a rifle. Some carry books, ideas, the weight of an entire people's hope. Jomo Kenyatta, the man whose voice had once echoed through meetings and town halls, stood as a symbol long before he stood trial. He wasn't seen marching through the forests with a bandolier across his chest. But the British still pointed at him. Called him the head of the snake. They needed a face to frame. A target for their headlines. And Kenyatta's face fit the frame too well. In 1952, they arrested him. And though debate still dances around his true role in the fighting, his name became stitched into the fabric of the resistance. Whether he lit the fire or simply carried the torch. But out in the forest, where the leaves knew secrets and the wind carried warnings, Dedan Kimathi wasn't just a name. He was a shadow that struck back. With dreadlocks crowned in rebellion and a pen as deadly as his gun, Kimathi wasn't fighting to be heard. He was fighting to change the sound of power forever. Strategy, discipline, loyalty. He turned the wild into a war zone. Beside him, another name rose, Stanley Mathinge. Part soldier, part spirit. Hard to pin down, harder to break. Together, they turned central Kenya's forests into a fortress. Commanding not with fear, but with fury born of justice denied. These weren't men playing war. They were men who had nothing left to lose. And that is the most dangerous kind of leader. October 20th, 1952. A date that dropped like thunder in a cloudless sky. The British didn't just wake up that morning, they reacted. They smelled smoke and called it a wildfire. Operation Jock Scott was their answer. A curtain of force dropped in the dead of night. Doors kicked in, names called out, wrists shackled before breakfast. Kenyatta was among the first, dragged from words into walls. Arrested not for leading men into battle, but for daring to dream too loudly. But rebellion doesn't end with an arrest, it scatters. And so, while the British aimed their nets at towns, the true warriors melted into the forests. Mount Kenya, the Aberdares, places where the trees knew no master. There, beneath the green cathedral, they became ghosts with purpose. Using bows and arrows, homemade guns, machetes shaped from scrap. Anything that could speak when the mouth stayed silent. Their warfare, quick and cruel. Strike at night, vanish by dawn. Ambushes, sabotage, whispers turned to war cries. And they weren't alone. Sympathizers, the aunt who passed on a message. The farmer who shared his food. The child who stood watch at the edge of the village. All became part of the resistance machine. The colonial heart beat heavy now. Not just from the sound of gunfire, but from the sound of people saying enough in action, not in words. The British didn't come to Kenya to whisper. When the forests began to breathe defiance, they answered with thunder. From 1953, under General Erskine's iron grip, they unleashed a military machine built to crush, not contain. Thousands of troops stomped through the highlands. Aerial bombings turned treetops into graveyards. Millions of bombs, not a figure of speech, but a cold, calculated flood from the sky. They weren't fighting ghosts. They were trying to erase them. But steel and fire weren't enough. So, they turned inward into people's homes, minds, and memories. Enter the pipeline. Not a waterway, but a chain of detention camps, where pain replaced policy, and screams were the only language understood. Here, they didn't just ask questions. They beat them out. Burned them out. Starved them out. Thousands of Kikuyu men, women, children were pulled in for screening. But what they found was not guilt, only grit. Still, the crown wasn't done. They wanted to strangle the rebellion at its roots. By mid-1954, they rolled out the villagization program. 1 million Kikuyu ripped from their homes, herded like cattle into protected villages, wrapped in barbed wire, patrolled by armed guards. Protection? No. It was a prison made of policy. A slow squeeze to break the Mau Mau's backbone. By cutting off the people who fed it, sheltered it, believed in it. This wasn't war in the open. It was war in the shadows. And Britain brought every blade it had. Every war has a cost. But this one, it bled beyond the battlefield. What happened in the shadows couldn't be dressed in honor. In the name of order, British hands grew monstrous. Fire was used not to light, but to punish. Beatings that left bones whispering. Mutilation, rape, and torture became the language of interrogation. Detainees, many without charge, were broken not with justice, but with pure, unfiltered cruelty. Officially, 1,090 executions on record. Unofficially, the soil remembers far more. Tens of thousands may have vanished into unmarked silence, their stories swallowed by the very camps meant to reform them. But the fire burned on both sides. The Mau Mau, too, crossed lines. March 1953, Larry. A night where vengeance turned civilian huts into funeral pyres. Flames danced over the bodies of men, women, and children. As rebels struck those seen as collaborators. It was merciless. It was real. British courts made examples of the captured. But even justice, then, wore a mask. This was no clean war. It was rage with no rules. And every drop of blood drawn from both sides blurred the line between freedom fighter and killer, between protector and predator. In this chapter of Kenya's story, the ink was red, and it refused to dry. By late 1956, the fire that once roared through Kenya's forests had begun to sputter. Guerrilla strength, once fierce and unyielding, was worn down by bullets, betrayal, and bare exhaustion. Leaders had fallen. Many were captured, others silenced by the same forests they once commanded. Supplies dwindled. Hope cracked. Yet the emergency dragged on, officially lingering until 1960. Like a storm cloud refusing to drift. Even after the rain had stopped. But underneath that heavy sky, something was shifting. Summer of 1960, in a room far from the forests. The first Lancaster House Conference opened its doors. Not with war cries or war paint, but with pens, papers, and promises that had once been denied. It was the beginning of a new language. One of majority rule. A seed sown not by goodwill, but by necessity, fear, and the sheer cost of control. This wasn't victory served on a silver platter. It was won in the mud, the blood, and the silence of a people who refused to stay down. Independence would come in 1963, but by 1960, the soil had already shifted. What was once seen as rebellion was now seen as a reckoning. And even if the British wouldn't say it out loud, they had heard Kenya's heartbeat. Loud, fierce, unstoppable. When independence came, it didn't come with a full rewrite. Not all stories made it into the spotlight. And the Mau Mau, those forest ghosts, those oath-takers, were swept quietly under the new nation's rug. Why? Because not every hero wore the same colors. Some of Kenya's new leaders had stood on the other side during the war, had shaken colonial hands, and they feared the power of truth once fully told. For decades, the word Mau Mau was a whisper, a warning, a name not taught in schools or printed in bold. It wasn't until 2003, yes, half a century later, that the Kenyan government finally stepped forward and called them what they were. National heroes. The forest warriors, once erased, were now etched in stone. And then, in 2013, after years of legal battles, the British government broke its silence. Not with fireworks or full confessions, but with a statement of regret. And a promise, compensation, for survivors of torture, pain, and silence too long endured. It wasn't enough, but it was something. A ripple across the still waters of history. The Mau Mau didn't win medals. They weren't paraded. But their echo never died. They were fire in the forest, blood in the soil, truth in the dark. And now, finally, names carved in light.